Finally, we visit a house in St. Louis built more than 170 years ago. And yet, in some ways, it's brand new again. Jim Kircher went to visit the famous landmark and its new addition.
If you know this building is the Eugene Fieldhouse and not much more than that, well, it's understandable. It's had something of an identity crisis of its own for years. The 1845 structure was originally part of a row of homes for the well-to-do on what was then the edge of town. But there's a brand new building now next door, and it's designed to redefine this place for a new generation. I hope I don't offend you by saying that the Eugene Fieldhouse, at some point, and maybe for a lot of people still today, is one of the best-known landmarks in downtown that they know nothing about.
Nothing about. They walk by, they go to a baseball game, they visit some of our local establishments, and they don't know what's in the house. So hopefully, with this new expansion, that curiosity of the St. Louis person is what's inside.
But before we go inside, let's go back a bit. It was in 2007 when I first started hearing what the people running the historic home/toy museum were thinking about. The museum board chair at the time was Bill Piper. There was a new ballpark just up the street and a newly acquired empty lot to build something. But it wasn't just a physical expansion they were talking about, but expanding the story they wanted to tell. This would not just be the boyhood home of a children's poet, but the home of his father, a lawyer who helped turn Dred and Harriet Scott's fight for freedom into a federal case.
When you look at the overall historical significance of this site, you can make an awfully good argument that it's really much more because of Roswell that it is a historic place of historic significance than because of Eugene, at least in this time.
The Scotts won their freedom in the old courthouse in St. Louis, but lost in the Missouri Supreme Court. Roswell Field kept the case alive and got it to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Scotts, of course, lost again in a decision that helped set the stage for the Civil War. When Roswell Field died in 1869, the newspaper reported the passing of a prominent citizen, but not a history maker. It was his son Eugene who would become famous nationally and internationally for his poetry, and without him, the house would not be around today. Eugene Field only lived here as a small child. His mother died when he was 6 years old, and his father sent him and his brother to live with relatives in New England. After going to college in Illinois and Missouri, he started working for newspapers in St. Louis, St. Joseph, Kansas City, and Denver. He was a columnist for the Chicago Daily News when he started publishing his poems. He also wrote some bawdy verse, limericks and such, and books. But it was his children's poems that made him a legitimate literary figure. When he died at just age 45, he was known as the children's poet. And 7 years later, in 1902, Mark Twain unveiled a plaque marking 634 South Broadway as the birthplace of Eugene Field. By the 20th century, the wealthy had long moved away from Walsh's Row, and in coming years it would sit in the midst of factories, parking lots, and filling stations. And when it was announced that the whole block was going to be torn down, there was a successful campaign to save the second-to-last row house, and donations of pennies from school children helped turn it into a museum. Pieces of furniture from Eugene Field's house in Chicago were brought down, but more importantly, the family donated Field's extensive collection of toys. And it has stood on South Broadway, alone, and sometimes even a little lonely, ever since. In post-war St. Louis, the southern edge of downtown was in decline and slated for urban renewal. Nearby buildings would be torn down, highways came through, and a baseball stadium and an arch would be built nearby. But the restored house and toy museum stayed pretty much what it was in the 1930s. But by the turn of this century, Eugene Field, despite all the elementary schools named for him around the country, was not the draw he once was. What had become the bigger story, African-American history, Roswell Field, Dred and Harriet Scott, that was what led to the home's designation in 2007 as a National Historic Landmark. But that story, frankly, was just too big for the little house.
And so the money was raised for the new addition, downsized from the original idea of recreating 2 more row houses. But this was designed with a nod to Walsh's Row.
So the windows are the doorways of what would have been the old row houses.
Right, so visually we
So
have a sense of
Yes.
what this was.
So here's your windowsills.
The Field House and Museum reopened to the public in December 2016. Inside the first exhibit, what's past as prologue, a house brimming with stories. It puts the 1845 historic home in the larger context of St. Louis, in a timeline that starts before the city's founding. Barbara Decker was the curator.
And so once you start with the house, then you have to think about the land on which the house was built. And of course, that's where the story begins.
Eugene Field is still with us. His toys are still here. His books are in the gift shop. And with all this new space, his boyhood home can do what it does best, be a great historic home. But they hope it's no longer a curious remnant, but something that is once again in the right place at the right time.
It really allows the story to continue. And this is just the beginning of the next chapter for us. So we're really excited.